All right, gang. It's the final week of semester here, final week of classes, and we are covering a couple of shorter pieces on this business of digital rhetoric or technology, rhetoric and technology. It's really, really challenging to come up with the final weeks of readings and topics for this class because, we're trying to cram within the space of a couple of weeks what's been happening for the last, 5+ decades. And, this is the stuff that is most immediately filtering into the stuff that you read and, get in classrooms and the conversations that we're having right now. It's just such a long tradition. So we got a lot of other stuff to get through. And then by the time we get up to our more or less contemporary moment, we don't have much time left, right? So, we did a week on new rhetoric as like argument with Perelman. And then we did a week on Burke, very important rhetorical theorist. Then crammed into last week just a couple of readings on the critical turn and postmodernity, and then we had to bounce out of that already and just trying to think about what else should we cover in this final week. And I think the big story needs to be the tech question, digital tech and devices and social media, and more than anything I'd say this is the topic or the subject matter that most needs to be talked about in terms of what's going on, right? So getting back to the very beginning of this class, I talked about rhetoric as something that we do. Just rhetoric describes how it is that we live together and how it is that we attempt to cooperate and coordinate and influence and persuade and reason with and organize with and get folks to do things, and maybe they want to do them or maybe they don't want to do them. But it's how that inventional process of how it is we attempt to manage our relations socially and politically and culturally. And then the theory flows out of how we're living as a kind of reflection on that, right? Codification of it. And so here we are, the last couple decades, the big story really has been the penetration into our lives of these things. And, here I am in my casita. We got a laptop, a digital laptop. I'm recording a video. I got a television screen on the wall here. I got my phone device next to me, and I'm connected to the Wi-Fi that's upstairs in my bedroom. And, the corona situation has been sort of manageable because of all this stuff, right? In terms of connecting with people and being able to do our jobs, it all is happening through the internet, through Wi-Fi, through our devices, right? So more than anything, this is, I think, the story of our contemporary moment and how we live and the ways that we live and the good and the bad and all the rest of it. So we have two readings that are, like I said, they're shorter pieces. And of these two, there's one that I just wanted to kind of go back a little bit and get a sense of sort of the conversation about rhetoric and digital tech going back 15 years or so, and then a more recent piece, right? So the first one by Zappen, Digital Rhetoric Toward an Integrated Theory, is from the year 2005. Published in Technical Communication Quarterly. And then the second one by Boyle, Brown, and Sarasso is 2018. So that one's quite fresh. And it's interesting because only 13 years separates these two essays, but in sort of digital time, or the change of, or the rate of change that we've witnessed since the kind of introduction of smartphones and all these new Apple technologies and Google and all the rest of it, things have just moved so rapidly, right? And so we can definitely see a very sort of sizable shift in how it is that rhetorical and communication scholars were thinking about the digital. So I'll spend just a little bit of time on the Zappen essay. The more important one is the next one, right? But just to kind of get going, a couple things here. So as I said, 2005, right? So I don't even know if you remember too much of what was going on in 2005. I actually just did a little bit of snooping around in terms of where were we in terms of technology and devices and inventions back in 2005. I had just taken this job at UNLV a year prior, like 2004 is when I came out with my PhD, and then that fall of 2004 I was a new assistant professor. So this is, brand new in terms of my academic life and career. And I'm trying to remember at the time sort of like how we were living, like what was I doing? And sure enough, our phones were important and the internet was important. But it's interesting to think of like, just again, how much has changed. So in 2005, YouTube was launched. YouTube, that we all know as like, basically the new television platform, was just launched that year. So when this first essay was written, YouTube didn't even exist really. Google Maps also was released in 2005, right? So Google Maps has become something that's really like penetrated into everyday life in so many ways. Whenever I travel into like far parts of the world, sure enough, Google Maps becomes actually pretty important for figuring out how to get to that weird place, and it tells you how to walk there, or public transportation, or even if you're on a bike, it'll tell you how long. And so this stuff's all like super useful and helpful when you're traveling, but you also got to ask questions about like, the implications of this stuff, and how is it so good, and how has it become so useful and necessary. But in any case, Google Maps came out. That was the year of Hurricane Katrina, the big storm down in New Orleans that just like destroyed New Orleans. 2003, just 2 years prior, the camera phone was invented. So we just were starting to take pictures on our phones with the camera. 2 years before that, in 2001, was the iPod. You guys remember iPods at all? Or were they like pretty much gone when you were growing up? I remember that, we had our phones where we like maybe did some texting and maybe took a picture here and there. But if we wanted to listen to music, we had this other thing, this little slender iPod. It started out like about the size of the first iPhone, and then it got smaller and smaller and smaller. It got so stinking small that like they were starting to disappear, these MP3 players. And then, of course, everything got smashed into our phones, and then we got rid of the iPods and the MP3 players. So that was just a few years prior, and the iPod was huge because it was portable music, and it was like the freeing up of, being able to go out and go to the gym, and you had your music, and we all felt very cool and mobile and independent, and we had our earbuds in, and we were listening to music, and it was just slick. A year after this piece came out, Hulu was first introduced. So again, something that feels very normal was just brand new. And then 2 years after this first essay, 2007 was the first iPhone, right? So the first iPhone, the smartphone wasn't even on the scene yet. So I mention all this because as I read this, now 15 years old, there's definitely like a kind of a shift of perspective. And so I can I think fairly confidently say to you that like at this time, communication scholars were starting to more and more take seriously this business of digital tech and mobile devices and so on. And rhetorical scholars, always a little bit behind sort of comms scholarship in general and media scholarship, but rhetorical scholars were starting to think about digital devices and portable devices as important rhetorical objects and considerations. But you can still see the kind of the bias in the assumptions about how it is that we might think about rhetoric in this way. And so like you can see as, Zappen's just kind of basically going through and summarizing some of the scholarship of the time and some of the ways that the scholarship was like thinking about the question of the digital. So to be thinking about computers or computing devices as persuasive, it's interesting because at the time, rhetorical scholars were all about texts. It took us quite a while, decades, to move away from thinking about rhetoric as just oratory, like speeches and public performances, to also think about, and this is thanks to Kenneth Burke, to also be thinking about like written texts and aesthetic texts and literary texts and film texts. And so, we had just been sort of like moving into this new place of like thinking about rhetoric as texts, like and a text as being potentially anything, as we saw with with Fisher, a text could be a scientific paper, a text could be a film, a text could be a song, and so on and so on. But it's always this kind of thing that mediates back and forth. The text is something that we read and that conveys, arguments and messages. And so rhetoric moved from orality into textuality, but, oh shoot. Someone's at the door here, yeah. Sorry. Good. They went away. Moving away from orality to textuality, but the textuality has its own limitations, right? Because it sort of presumes arguments, and it presumes, meaning making and intentionality, and it presumes some sense of a response on the part of an audience, right? And so there's still a kind of a boundedness in terms of how we think about rhetoric, right? It's like it was created by someone, it went into this text, and then the text gets read or picked up by some other audience member or reader or community, and then we can talk about a kind of a rhetorical transaction. So a lot of this early work that Zappen is citing here is sort of still thinking about these new emergent technologies as texts, right? And so this is what the next essay talks about, is sort of the visual bias, right? It's like, oh, now we're not talking about books, we're just talking about screens. All right, so fine. Now we just think about this thing as electronic or digital communication, and then we still bring in all of our old assumptions about arguments and about persuasiveness, and we can sort of understand mediated text that way, right? So page 321 is probably the best, I think, page of this essay, or getting at some of the key stuff here. So characteristics, affordances, and constraints. This business of affordance and constraints is sort of the next wave of thinking about digitality as rhetorical. And here the goal is to be thinking about the medium itself, right? And so this particular medium is different from the medium that I'm talking on here, which is different from the medium that's on the wall there, which is different from this medium, if some of you are wearing that thing, which is different from whatever else, your office desk or whatever other device you might have, right? So to be thinking about affordances and constraints is a good way to think about this thing itself and what it affords in terms of making your life smoother, easier, quicker, whatever, but also what it constrains and what it kind of makes more difficult. And so I really like what he says here about 5 lines down. Gurak identifies some of the basic characteristics: speed, reach, anonymity, and interactivity. So if you think about the medium itself and you just try to understand the basic qualities or characteristics of the medium, then you can start thinking about what it affords and what it prevents or inhibits, right? So obviously these things are speed, right? So you can calculate, they're computational devices. You can get information quickly, you can send information quickly, you can map your way around, right? So speed, reach, anonymity, and interactivity. But there's sort of two sides to this, right? So speed encourages an oral and casual style, but it also encourages redundant and repetitive postings. So you get things quicker, you get them sort of more redundantly, right? Reach permits communication among multiple participants in an array of media and on a global scale. However, it does not include the benefits of gatekeeping. So reach means that more inclusion, more voices, but then you have the kind of the risks of the unfiltered quality, right? So the gatekeeping part. What else we got here? Anonymity encourages experiments in self and gender identities, but also problematizes notions of authorship and ownership and encourages flaming, right? We, I think, well know the problems of anonymity, right? And then interactivity permits closer access to other people, but also permits increased opportunities for intrusions upon personal privacy. So now, rhetorical scholars are starting to get a little bit more attentive to what these things do, not just as pages that kind of mediate ideas and arguments, but that has shaped behaviors and perceptions and attitudes in and of themselves, right? And different kinds of devices have different kinds of affordances and not others. So it then, finishes off on 322 and 3 here, talking about this business of okay, so if the internet and, you know, its operation through these specific kinds of technologies and devices is not maybe just about mediating arguments in the way that we might think about a speech or an essay or an op-ed piece or something like that, then what else is it affording and constraining? And sure enough, we start to get into this business of identities and communities, right? And so sure enough, what we find on the internet is that it does provide all this openness and inclusive sort of reach and so on, but that sure enough, people, when they find each other in this open space, they react negatively to those who are not like them, and they act very positive to those who are. And so the business of identity formation becomes really important here, right? And so the scholarship is kind of moving in this way of thinking about the devices as being less about like pure information. You know, I still remember the arguments early on about what the internet was going to make possible. It's like, imagine like the world's information is just unleashed, right? Like then you should all have the best possible arguments. We all have access to the best of what has been like produced and studied and researched and written about, and the most genius stuff is all available. So if that's the case, then why would we ever be wrong ever again? It's like, wow, we have gone like so far in the opposite direction of like just finding the information that we like, right? And so that gets to this whole business of like desire and feeling. And more, these devices, what they're seen to mediate is less like pure information and more like sensation and feeling and a sense of like sort of Burkean identification and division, right? So the information is valenced in a way where we're kind of predisposed to like certain information and predisposed to not like other information. And so the business of communities and identities taking shape becomes really, really accelerated and amplified in digital platforms. And that's becoming more and more the kind of the discovery about the rhetoricity of these devices. So identity formation, yeah, it's key. Business of social ties and social bonds and how it is that we find each other and stick together and then gatekeep others away and so on. I mean, any day that I'm on Twitter, I'm seeing so much of this. I'm seeing people who like say things that maybe seem crazy, but like all kinds of people rally around them and celebrate and cheer. And then, you know, it just feels like teams most of the time. It's like, yay, that, us, and screw them. And like, you guys are so wrong, you have no idea. And, you know, there's not so much of the like, the kind of deliberative, persuasive back and forth that we thought might happen early on back in the early 2000s, right? The last thing I would mention about this first piece is, you know, she's talking about the importance of ethos in terms of identity formation. And we can update the concept of ethos for the digital, for our digital context by maybe thinking about the question of persona, which is very closely connected to the idea of ethos, right? As Aristotle said, ethos is essentially the image that the audience has of you in their mind, right? How you're coming across. Not necessarily like who you are deep down in your soul, but the kind of the public presentation of yourself. More like a persona, right? And so if you think about profiles and personas, you can think about that aspect of like identity construction and ethos as being kind of like your outward face of your identity on the internet, right? And so that's an interesting way of talking about it. Now, this dude said that he's going to sort of start theorizing digital rhetoric, but he doesn't really do that at all. He just kind of gestures in a few places at the very end there. And it's interesting, the questions that he's asking on 324 at the very end are really questions that are steeped in this old, more traditional way of thinking about rhetoric as deliberative and persuasive, and it's sort of Aristotelian and Isocratean. He says, what is the potential of the internet to foster creative collaborations, to promote development of scientific communities, produce new ideas and significant research results, to cultivate interest, disseminate information, and encourage discussion? All of these questions are questions that rhetorical scholars were asking early on. Like, how can the internet help us be more deliberative in the way that we would like to be deliberative, going back to our oral tradition, right? And you can see just how kind of outdated I think that set of questions is when we move into the next piece, because we're no longer asking those kinds of questions, because we're no longer thinking about the digital as just another way of thinking about social mediation as persuasion, as deliberation, but that this new kind of landscape, this digital kind of life world that we now inhabit has really just changed the game of how it is we encounter and react to one another. So with that, we'll move into the second piece, the digital. This is Rhetoric Behind and Beyond the Screen by Casey Boyle, James Brown, and Steph Carasso, don't know. This is a little piece that was published in the Centennial. No, I'm sorry, this is RSQ. I was thinking QJS. This is not the Centennial, but this was a special issue on like key terms in rhetoric right now, sort of 2018. What are some of the key topics in rhetoric? And so this business of the digital was definitely in there, right? And so you have Casey Boyle has a really interesting book on digital rhetoric and post-humanism. And then the other guys are also working in this realm as well. And so they put out this piece in which they're trying to extend our understanding of the digital beyond the screen, beyond the text, beyond even the sort of thinking about mediation as this kind of audience, speaker, back and forth kind of thing. So we'll get to the key stuff in just a quick moment here. They start off by kind of doing a quickie version of this history by saying, early on, rhetorical scholars were thinking about the digital in terms of screens, in terms of visual, right? So the digital equals electronic screen. Electronic screen is something that we look at, that calls out for our attention. Think about, the videos that we see online. Think about memes. Think about, the importance of YouTube and Instagram. It's all visual, right? But they want to be careful to not just reduce the digital to the electronically mediated visual kind of aspect of the whole thing, because they, as they note, there's way more going on here. So they say on 252, that first start of the first full paragraph, the digital is no longer conditional on particular devices, but has become a multisensory, we'll get into that, embodied condition through which most of our basic processes operate. We witness the pervasiveness of digital practices in the multiplicity of smartphones and wearable technologies fitting into our lives in ways no longer called to our conscious attention, right? And so early rhetorical work on the digital, was again thinking about screens as texts, something that we sort of deliberately and consciously engage in. And when we do, we are assuming sort of deliberate and conscious engagements on the part of others. Blogs were an important new medium back in 2005 when that kind of stuff was being written, right? So blogs are just more casual, kind of newspaper columns, right? But they're live, they're dynamic, and sort of ongoing, and they're the whole business of speed and nowness and openness was very excited, right? But the blog was still kind of like the privileged way of thinking about the digital, and we've moved past this here. So they're trying to grapple with the ways that our digital lives have grown, expanded, and digital technologies have sort of infiltrated more and more of our lives, right? So they introduced this business of transduction, right? Not induction and not deduction, but transduction, which we'll return to in the end there. Right, good. Yeah, this business of an ambient condition as well. So my mom's favorite word is ambiance. Whenever she goes to a restaurant, she loves a restaurant if it has ambiance. And I love that restaurant. It has ambiance. We used to make fun of her. Every time she would love a restaurant, such nice ambiance. It's like, what's ambiance, right? It's just kind of like this general condition, this sort of, it's in the air, right? There's something about the entirety of that restaurant space. It's the lighting, it's the size and the layout, it's the music that's playing overhead, it's the fact that you can smell the roses from the rose bush off to the side, maybe you can hear the waves off in the distance you're on the shore. So that whole ambient condition is like the entirety of your kind of lived, walking through certain landscapes. The argument here is that digitality is sort of a part of all of it, and it's quietly nudging us and grabbing at us in ways that we might not be very aware of because it's multisensory. It's happening in all different kinds of levels. So transduction is the way sort of digital influence moves and comes around and mediates through our senses and comes into our eyes and maybe our ears and comes out of our fingertips because we type something and send it off and it zips over there and it becomes sound, right? That's all transductive, right? It's operating over thresholds of certain media and different registers of meaning, which they'll get back to. All right, so yeah, so the next page, 253, they talk about the kind of the visual bias of early communication scholars on digital. And they just note that like it's too limited to think of the digital in terms of just the merely visual, right? So we got to think about sound, we got to think about taste, touch, all of the senses, a multisensory ambient condition. So multisensory rhetorics, 254, right at the top there, it says, a turn toward other senses amplifies the subterranean, invisible, yet material nature of digital processes that resonate with the moment in which we now find ourselves. All right, so you might still be saying, how is it multisensory? So how many of you, I wonder, are wearing an Apple Watch or some kind of digital watch? I have never worn one, but I understand that they operate through what's known as haptics, which is like touch. And so if you get some kind of a message, you might get a pulse on your wrist, right? And my understanding is that like there's different kinds of touch rhythms for different kinds of messages, right? So just the way that there's like different kinds of ringtones and vibrations that you can, or even like those lights that flash, right? Same thing with your watch. You can get different kinds of like touch signatures based on the kind of message that comes in, right? And so right there, that's touch. That's how it is that a message can go from someone's fingertips through a device and literally like touch your skin, right? Let's see. I have done a little bit of research and a little bit of writing on this phenomenon of ASMR, the autosensory meridian response, I think that's called, where we're talking about sound now, right? But there's a lot of YouTube channels of people eating food, and the whole point of people watching these videos is to enjoy the sounds of the chewing. Apparently people love this ASMR stuff. It soothes them. It gives them comfort. They find some kind of connection through just the sounds of the smacking and people do this with like paper, different, scratching at a microphone. It's not just food, but this like the creation of amplified, low-level, grainy, everyday noises is apparently like a big draw for some people. And so again, how it is that like me just living here, sending out certain messages, creating certain videos, and others are drawn to them, not just because of the visual, because of the reading of the text thing, but because it offers this fully embodied kind of engagement, right? So this is what they're talking about in terms of this kind of, the digital is not just specific technologies, and it's not just signals kind of creating images. This is an immersive world of influences and mediation, and it's all around us. I don't know how many of you have the Amazon Home thing with Alexa, I think it is, or some Google device. I don't know what that one's called, but like this whole business of the smart home, where you just like sit in your room and you say, hey, start the microwave and cook me a whatever, right? It's like we're really sort of pushing into that like sci-fi future that we used to dream about, where it's like my house does everything for me, right? And so talk about an ambient condition of digital kind of operations, right? Where our food can be made. So we can like, with our voices, create smells, and just like the possibilities are so ongoing here. But the point is like so much of this stuff is happening below our immediate conscious attention. My wife pays our vehicle insurance, our automotive insurance, and it's, she's dealing with, I think, 3 vehicles, and including our oldest son, who's in that category where even if he's a good driver, his age bracket and his gender means that he pays like ridiculous amounts of insurance. So my wife was looking for ways of saving on insurance, and sure enough, State Farm offered this. As someone who's now started to research this stuff, it really bugged me. But State Farm has this new program where it's like if you install this little plastic device with some kind of sensory chips in it and let us track all your driving habits and give us that data, we will give you discounts on your monthly insurance, right? And so they get to know everywhere I travel, how fast I travel. They even know when I pick up my phone and look at my phone, and they give me these daily reports if I want to see them, right? And it's just this little thing that you stick on your windshield right behind the mirror. You don't even see it. But sure enough, all this stuff is happening, right? So right now during this corona pandemic, there's all kinds of information about where we're going. And so Google has it, Apple could give it up if they wanted, right? But primarily Google is very, very, very aware of like where you go and when and how long and how quickly and so on. So it's all around us. It's just sort of our ambient condition, right? Top of 255, sunken suasion. A multisensory approach to the digital requires that we attend to processes behind and beyond the screen. So this is what's key now. So if in the earlier essay, the whole point was to be thinking about digital in terms of screens as text and it's visual and they mediate ideas and arguments, here we are now thinking about the screens themselves and the operations behind and below the screen as themselves having rhetorical shaping kinds of influences, right? And again, in ways that we might not be very familiar with. But that now we're starting to get into the stuff of our moment right now. I have grad students writing about this stuff. I've written some stuff on my own, and scholars are coming out with books on this sort of like the rhetorical power of algorithms and infrastructures, right? So it's not just about like the messages and the signals and the information that gets sent back and forth. It's about the platform and how the platform creates certain kinds of influences and prohibits others, or how it is that the algorithmic coding that's going into the devices that's sort of sifting certain information out and biasing other information for specific ends, like how all this stuff is creating certain kinds of messages, certain kinds of values, certain kinds of behaviors and attitudes and values, right? And so I think I mentioned in a previous video this book, The Algorithms of Oppression, right? Because scholars are starting to realize that these algorithms are just these kind of bits of code that tell programs how to operate, how to kind of like make decisions based on certain inputs and based on certain outputs, certain conditions, right? But they're not neutral, they're not perfect, they're not innocent, right? That the algorithms in fact shape us. And I think I posted that video by Zainab Tefeki where she talks about YouTube's algorithm recommending system, right? It pushes you. It pushes you in more extreme directions. If you're listening to music on Apple or Spotify or whatever, they all have algorithmic-based recommendation systems, right? So you can tweak those systems to like push people to listen to more of this kind of music or more of that kind of a music, and you can kind of code these devices to nudge people in certain directions. And so there's a lot of influence that's happening before our conscious awareness even catches it, right? And this is where I'm quite interested in all this stuff, because my work's on sort of hidden sources of influence, invisible influence, as I call it, right? So thinking about in the world of food, it's like sugar and salt and fat and how those things get kind of jacked into certain food. We crave that, and we might not even be aware of why. Like, why is it that tomato sauce is sugary today, whereas it used to be not sugary, right? People love sugar, and so if you put it in things like tomato soup or tomato sauce or yogurt or whatever, things that you might not have thought of as being particularly sweet, sure enough, people respond. They like that, right? And so I'm fascinated by this question of invisible or hidden influence or low-level influence. And algorithms and platforms, these things nudge us in ways that we're not really aware of. Now, most people don't care too much, right? They just think, oh, well, whatever. It's not nefarious, but I'm someone who sort of wants to at least know if I'm being, encouraged in a certain way or discouraged in a certain way. And so all of this stuff is potentially rhetorical because it shapes our thoughts and values and attitudes and moods, and it pushes us in different directions. I'm also tickled by the fact that they mentioned Dicopia here at the top of 255. Um, they say that this tradition extends much deeper into the rhetorical tradition, demonstrating that rhetorical exercises like Erasmus's copia were essentially computational machines. Their point is like, we've understood the kind of the rhetorical powers of computation for a while, and even Erasmus was doing something like, creating geometric scaling through his business of stylistic amplification and invention. So it's quite interesting. Need to wrap up here. Let's see, 35. Yeah, it's plenty. So let's see. This business of transduction. Actually, first we'll just point to this business of infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is emerging as the kind of the big concern here. How it is that infrastructures enable, how it is that they disable. I don't know if you guys have noticed that your internet connections probably have gotten worse since this quarantine business kicked in. Right, that has to do with infrastructure. That has to do with literally the kind of the physical built environment of the internet, right? And how much traffic the servers can handle, the download speeds, right? How much you're paying a month for your plan, and what that enables you to watch or not watch, right? And so it's like things are getting really blurry. I've heard about two-tiered systems in terms of like if you pay this much or if you don't pay enough, then you get better quality, and essentially you have access to certain kinds of things and you don't have access to other kinds of things based on where you find yourself in terms of sort of socioeconomic differences and the needs of your life and so on. But this business of infrastructure is also importantly rhetorical because it has to do with, again, affordances and constraints. What's made available to consumers and what is not, right? So again, platforms, infrastructures, the kind of the built realities of all of this stuff. All of this is, we've moved from the screen as a page outward and downward, essentially, thinking about sort of what's inside the screen and what comes before the screen and what enables the screen at all, right? So thinking about servers and whenever I think about the internet, I often think about these cables that exist on the bottom of the ocean, right, in the Atlantic Ocean. Like, how is it that we're connected to Europe? Fundamentally, it's a big fat cable at the bottom of the ocean that contains all of these fiber optic cables that actually do the job of transmitting information, right? So even though we think of this as a kind of immaterial virtual world, it's happening on like actual physical cables, right? How much these things cost, how speedily they work, who gets to use them, the better ones versus the worst ones. All of that stuff is potentially relevant thinking about how it is that our ambient digital conditions are structured, right? So that's the infrastructure. So then they finish off on 257 talking about transduction. They say about 7 lines in that section, transduction refers to how a signal moves across disparate registers of relations. Neural firings move from fingers to keystrokes and then transform intellectual charges, become digital bits, or delivered to a screen by software, or saved to a hard drive that becomes transcoded again whenever someone opens a file. So I can create some kind of a, voice message that I send off to somewhere on the other side of the world, and someone can download it and create an art installation from that, and someone can create a recipe from that art installation based on some message I sent 50 years ago. Who knows, right? I mean, the possibilities for like signals and influence to move and spread and change, that's what they're interested in here. So they're not so much interested in persuasion anymore. They're not interested in like deliberation or meanings or readings or interpretation, that kind of more cognitive aspect of thinking about rhetoric more traditionally. Now it's about sensation, and it's about feelings, and it's about how it is we live with these devices and how we use them to do new things, create things, respond to things, how we use them creatively, how we mix and mingle, right? Messages from one place and affordances from another place. And so we find ourselves in this, again, this kind of ambient digital environment. And, we are just sort of digital all the way through, right? We're not there yet, but Google introduced Google Glasses a while back, where the idea was to like have us all be walking around with essentially internets right in front of our faces, where we could do all kinds of things. For some reason, they didn't take off, even though in movies, all kinds of like sci-fi type stuff, those glasses are still prominent in terms of how we think about the future, right? I'm not sure if anyone's picked this up yet, but I watched the entirety of this new series on Amazon over the weekend called Upload. And it's fascinating. It's about sort of digital technology and how it affects how we live and where we're going. And the whole point is like in the near future, we will have the ability to download our consciousness, or at least our kind of the sum total of our brain activity, into a computer right before we die. And then we can upload that into these digital heavens. But the fascinating twist is that we have to pay for these afterlives, right? And so we have our choices. Depending on how much money we have, we can go to a really luxurious afterlife, or we get stuck in basically like, communist Russia or whatever, where we get like no goodies. And it's just fascinating to think through some of the kind of cultural questions and implications of this stuff, and how, it's not all innocent. It's not like the internet's just this wonderfully wide open, free space of play like we originally thought it might be back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So rhetoric's sort of everywhere, and it's not just in terms of like texts and persuasion and arguments. It's really about how it is that minds and bodies and subjectivities are being pushed and grabbed and encouraged and enabled by all of the digital technology that we are surrounded by and that we use on a daily basis. And so we want to be thinking rhetorically about all this kind of stuff, like what are we able to do with these tools, right? What kinds of relations might we be able to create? Like happy hour, digital happy hour is kind of a big thing of the corona quarantine, right? It's like we find ways of using these mediational devices to kind of serve new cooperative ends or conflictual ends or meaning-making ends or whatever. But the point is like what we do with them, right? Not only what they do to us. That's kind of my interest, is like how it is that they shape our thoughts and they kind of bias us in certain directions, but also how we work with them and what we create using them and through them. So that's sort of where things stand now. That's where a lot of work in rhetoric is now bending, my own included, just trying to like make sense of this stuff, because it's so much a part of our everyday lives and how we talk and relate and think, and even how we perceive the world and how it comes at us, right? It's all valenced. It's all shaped and, mediational in the way they talk about it here with John Durham Peters. Mediation is not just this kind of like ping pong thing. Mediation shapes, right? Something that's mediated is also influence. This is Marshall McLuhan's idea of the medium as the message, right? So mediums and the things that, mediate back and forth, mediate them in very specific ways. And they all kind of do it differently, right? If you are attempting to mediate with a hammer, it's going to be a very different kind of experience than if you attempt to mediate with a ruler, right? The different technology gives rise to different possibilities. And so that's where a lot of work is right now, is to thinking about the kinds of social behaviors that are changing, and the cultural behaviors that are changing, the political attitudes that are changing because of our relations and interactions with all this stuff. So that's where I'll stop. And that's it for this semester, gang. So I will have more stuff coming out in terms of the final assignments, but I hope all is well out there. You have a week. I'm going to be pushing the final test from Monday to Wednesday, just so to give us all a little more time to study and get ready. The viewer counts for these last few videos are still pretty low, so we need to be doing some video watching. We need to be doing some, going through and making sure we're okay. I will be uploading some study prompts and assistance this week as well, the next day or so, to help you out. And then we're there. We're almost there. So hang in there. Hope all's well. And talk to you soon.